Let us pray. Lord God, we give you thanks for this day. Here we are, for our own reasons, worshiping you together. Bless us. Help us to be blessed by you, to find you in the ways we need you, to be a blessing in your holy name. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. Jesus said it. Stay awake. So you have to stay awake in my sermon. Everybody awake. Good. So in a book that Percy Walker wrote, The Moviegoer, there is a commuter, a man commuting home from work from his very successful job in the city. He is a man who feels inexplicably bad, considering all the many reasons he has to feel good. Perhaps some of us can relate to feeling that way on occasion. Suddenly, while on the train, he suffers a heart attack, and he has to be removed from the train at a station where he had passed by countless times but had never visited. When the commuter regains consciousness, he's there in a strange place, in a strange hospital, surrounded by strangers. And he looks around, and in the midst of all this strangeness, what catches his eye is this hand laying on the sheet ahead of him. It moves. It is his own hand. And he's captivated by it. It's as if he's never noticed his own hand, or at least not in a way that appreciated it. And he begins to be captivated by this extraordinary thing as it moves this way and that. These hands can do so much. They've done so much. But for what? In this story, through the heart attack, the commuter was able to encounter himself, his life, in a way that he had not for many years, because he had been so absorbed with his, what he calls, Walker calls, everydayness. The ordeal of nearly dying restored him to himself. And it was then obvious that what he chose to do with that experience now would be the burden of his entire future. Would he go back to sleep? Or would he manage to stay awake? Death, nearness of death, is a harsh but effective teacher. The author Peter Kreeft wrote those words after he nearly lost his 5-year-old daughter to a brain tumor. Death, the nearness of death, can be a harsh but effective teacher. When every little thing may be our last little thing, then we are able to see how truly huge those little things are, aren't we? And how those big things, unfortunately, the big things that we treat as if they were big, they end up showing themselves to be really nothing at all. The English poet Walter de la Mare advises that we should look our last on all lovely things every waking hour. And I think many of us here today can relate to these stories, to this story, to this being awakened by the nearness of death, by the presence of death in our lives. How you can see life so much more clearly than you could before. It's songs like Live Like You Were Dying. There's a reason why that country song was outplayed, overplayed for about 2 years, I believe. We can relate. I certainly have stories like this in my life. My father, when I was in my 20s, nearly died of a heart attack. And I can remember vividly our family all huddled around. After that experience, when I went back to Indianapolis where I lived, it was after that I changed some decision makings and accepted a position that was more about family than about money and prestige for the first time in my life. I could see things more clearly with the nearness of death. The darkness of death can shed a great light in our lives. That's what I'm saying. Isn't that strange? This is strange. What seems to be total darkness can be such light for our living. This is what Jesus is drawing upon in our gospel reading today. Jesus, where he's talking about this thing, and we can argue about what he's talking about. about whether he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, that happened a few years after, 30 years after this, or whether he's talking about the second coming and the second. And what I say is, yes, he's talking about all those things. But what the most important thing he's talking about, what you need to glean from this, is he's saying that life, as you know it, your human life on earth, is going to come to an end. And it will be like a thief in the night. So stay awake. He is drawing upon that great teacher, which is death. And he's saying, use the light of that knowledge that your life will end to live well, to stay awake in the current moment. He says over and over, 3 times, 4 times, keep alert, keep awake. But if I'm honest with Jesus today, I think we need to push back. Because this whole thing about living as you were dying, it fits mighty well into country music songs and to poems. But into everyday life, how can a person possibly live like they're dying every waking moment? I mean, that's exhausting. So we need to push back a minute. I've got a dear friend, her name's Lisa. And Lisa's best friend, a few years ago, received the terrible news that she had cancer of the appendix, which is a very rare and fast-moving cancer. And so she knew it was a death sentence, but she fought a good battle, lived longer than most. And a few months into that battle, my friend Lisa, she's very artsy, so she quoted this quote of Walter de la Mare about how we should live every waking moment as if it was our last. And her best friend, she turned on her. She said, I hate that quote. I wish people would stop saying that because it's impossible. It's exhausting. Do y'all remember Freddy Krueger? Freddy Krueger. All right, he's a horror figure with razor blade fingernails. I mean, he was terrifying in my youth. Well, she said that living with the knowledge of your death like she had been doing was like living with Freddy Krueger in the house. And every day she would wake up and Freddy Krueger would be in the closet. And he would jump out. And every day it would scare the life out of her very thoughts. And she was obsessed with it. And she'd go off and she'd live on the edge of her seat, aware that every day may be her last. Until one day, she opened that closet and Freddy jumped out. And she said, oh, hey, Freddy, would you hand me that sweater vest over there? I think it'd make my butt look good. She was worried about other things. Onward with life. She said it's exhausting. And it's not realistic to think that you can live every day of your life as if it were the last. And every moment make a decision as if you will not have the next. And if we kept reading this section of Mark, we see that it reveals this truth as well. In the very next chapter, Jesus is there in Gethsemane. And what happens there? He leaves his disciples and he says, y'all stay awake. The hour is now. It is not tomorrow. It is right now. Stay awake for a minute. I'm going to go over here and pray. And over he returns. And what are they doing? They're asleep. Over and over. We know that death, which seems to be great darkness, can shine a great light into our day-to-day living. We just can't seem to live by that light. In Jesus' words from the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing, Jesus, but the flesh, come on. So what are we to do? What are we to do? Don't look away, America. Don't look away. I've reflected on this message all week long, and I've sort of looked forward to trying to struggle with it with you all, because it is a very relevant message that we glean from this gospel reading for our culture. Our culture today has a way of death that is terrible. It is called the American way of death. It is terribly unhelpful, let me say. The American way of death. And the American way of death is to avoid thinking about it altogether. It's to change the stinking subject. That is the American way of death. We see death as only failure. In our great medical system, and it is great, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars to deny death. And therefore, when someone dies, something has failed, we don't even want to tell the patients that they're going to die. We want to avoid it altogether. And when we do address the topic in literature and books, when we do address it, we do not seek truth. What we seek truly is comfort. We want to make peace with death so that we can stop thinking about it and live our lives like it's not there, like Freddy's not in the closet. Even the books that talk about death being natural and being part of nature, truly, if you flip it over and look closely, you understand that it's truly a part of trying to make peace so we can not think about it anymore. Now, death is a part of nature, and it is natural. And we now know, thanks to science, that death is even programmed into our cells. Our cells are programmed to live, and our cells are programmed to die. Death is part of life. We eat dead plants and dead animals. What dies fertilizes and brings new growth. It's almost like death is a fuel for life. So in a way, we cannot die. That death is a part of life. However, there's something very interesting about death and important when we consider it as part of nature that we can see for ourselves. In nature, you see that nothing is final. It is cyclical. Things are reoccur. Things are reused. Everything gets done again, and all is a cycle. Nothing is final except one thing, and that is your death and the death of your loved ones. There is no second go-around for us. Death is a total finality of relationships in this life. It is the only final act in nature. And therefore, this sheds a light on why people, since the beginning of time, and all myths and religions have always seen death as being natural, but also unnatural, an accident. They see death as being transcendent of nature and yet beyond. Death is natural, but in death we see something. We see the great exception. And what science shows us is that it is in the exception where our investigation should begin and not end. Death is amazing, and that it is natural, and yet it is so far beyond. So we must not look away. We must not look away, America, from this great light of death. But again, listen, we cannot live our lives as if each will be the last. So what will we do with it? We cannot live each moment reflecting upon that deed. But we can allow death to be our teacher on a regular basis and to listen to its effective lessons. I have 3 tidbits about this effective lessons and how to live with awareness of death. The first draws from Peter Kreeft, who I mentioned earlier. He reflects after almost losing his daughter. He reflects that really an encounter with the nearness of death leaves us knowing 3 things very clearly. We know that life is precious. We know whose precious gift life really is. And we know that we are complete beggars. That we know of our total poverty. That all human beings indeed are beggars begging from the one who has the power of life. And therefore it is in this light of death that as we start this Advent that we can see Christmas morning, and God becoming man, is God giving us beggars the greatest present imaginable, the answer to that terrible question of death. He gives us life through the darkness. And the second tidbit is from my own life. So learning how to live with the knowledge of death truly is an important spiritual practice. Mine began for me in Indianapolis. My mother, one day I was working, and she sent me a copy of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Many of you have probably read it. And in that he has an exercise of envisioning your future. Envisioning your funeral, where those your loved ones and people you know stand around your funeral and you imagine what they will say about you and feel about you. And that was a very wonderful way to help bring the light of death into your thinking. But then it couldn't stop there, because Death is a good teacher, but as soon as it leaves the room, you start acting like the class clown again, or at least I tend to. So over time, what this has become for me is something, and I found myself doing it again this week. Hesitated to share, but I will. For me in my life, as I seek to follow Christ in this way, to use this great light, I find myself when I pull up and before work, and oftentimes before bed at night, I ask the question of where I am now, when this is over, when I'm gone, when my kids are grown, when I'm no longer here at Holy Cross. What will I look back upon this day and wish I'd paid more attention to? What is it that I wish I valued more today when I'm there, when it's over? For me, that always tends to be people over tasks, love over messy houses, that sort of stuff. And the third thing I will share with you is a quote that I came across that stuck in my teeth this week. It's one I think is very wonderful. There is nothing as meaningless as an answer without a question. Jesus, the baby in the manger, is the answer to the question of death. But if we refuse to look at the question, then the answer, Jesus, will remain just platitudes, and death, an unanswerable menace in our lives. This Advent, let us begin by hearing Jesus' call to not look away, so that you might receive God's answer, God's good news of Jesus more and more into your hearts and lives. Amen.
Amen.